first thing I want to say is kind of talking about race and racism, and that's hard in lots of different ways. Lots of people kind of hold this. I remember in September 2019, I was running a thing with kind of race equity advocates and activists, and I started crying. And the reason why I want to say that is because you realise how much you kind of hold, yeah? And we're all holding stuff around race and racism. And so what I'm going to talk about is really, really serious, but in a way, what I'm inviting all of us to do is to kind of connect a really human way with it, kind of with a kind of spirit of openness, because that's how we do the work. Right, so that's my preamble. As John said, not very catchy, but this is Beyond Home Truths towards life-affirming, race, equity-focused voluntary sector. And it really builds on work that I've done with colleagues at Voice for Change England and also Akivo, the leadership organisation in the voluntary sector. And just take this opportunity to thank my Akivo co-authors, Christiana Rickson and Maisie Hulbert for their excellent kind of contribution to all of this work. So in this talk I'd like to focus on, to do what Home Truths did actually, which was to focus on the voluntary sector both as a site of racism and a potential wellspring for race equity. And I want to centre my comments around the work that we did in Home Truths, and also to update it, I'll talk to you a little bit about Home Truths 2, which we hope we'll be able to get off the ground before the end of the year, and that changes the focus. Also, I should thank the lottery for funding it, because you do that stuff, and I don't know if anyone in the lottery, I don't think they really like the report because I mentioned racism a lot, but still. I do appreciate their resource. I think perhaps the first thing to say is just something about the kind of racial moment that we're in. And I think there's kind of a particular set of things that have happened. And I think what is interesting is probably 18 months, possibly 18 months ago, we wouldn't have been having this kind of conversation in this kind of way. And I think that does trouble me in a way, because it's not as if racism was invented 18 months ago. So this has been a kind of long-standing issue. But there are particular circumstances that have brought it to our attention in a different kind of way, and as I'm sure you all appreciate. So my speaking diary over the last year has been much, much busier than it has ever been. And that does trouble me. I think nothing is about one thing, but it does seem plain that the murder in plain sight of George Floyd has encouraged these kinds of conversations. It seems to have taken an act of racialized ultra-violence to enable us to have these much needed and long overdue conversations about racism. And I have thought, what would have happened if George Floyd had been murdered in the police car or in the police station hidden from view? Because that's what they were actually trying to do, they were trying to get him into the car. So we can't know whether we'd be having these kind of conversations. I think in some ways we just need to be mindful of these circumstances that have brought questions of race and racism to the fore. And what I hope, one of the reasons why I wanted to do this talk was I hope that this focus that we have now stays. There has been a tendency to want to make kind of racism and thinking and talking about racism go away, and I hope part of our work today will to be ensure that that doesn't happen. And I did say talk of racism to go away, not actual racism. Unfortunately, we're not there yet. In the meanwhile, whatever has brought us to this moment, I think there are really important questions for the voluntary sector on race and racism. So here are some important questions, I think. So what will it take to dismantle racism and replace it with racial justice? What are the cherished beliefs that mean we can't let go of racism as a society? And what are the new beliefs that we will need to cherish sector and as a society in the future. So these are what I would call higher order questions, and they're not managerial questions. Managerial questions are important. They're important to leadership. But these questions are a different order of questions. Questions such as how can an organisation hire in more diversity, or how can an organisation message what they are trying to achieve with respect to race, or what are appropriate equity, diversity and inclusion targets. So those types of managerial questions really do matter. They're about doing the work. But I do think that we must keep in mind these higher order questions and keep our attention on the roots of racism and the scope and scale of transformation that we need. So on to home truths. In late 2017, I reached out to Akiva to ask them if they'd like to do something together on race and the charity sector, and this work ended up becoming Home Truths. The animating spirit of the work was that while there was quite a lot of interest in the time about questions of workforce diversity or lack of diversity in the voluntary sector and the charity sector, there did seem to be little or no sense that this disproportionality was part of a larger issue or problem. By way of contrast, one of the foundational insights starting on Home Truths was that a diversity problem in the charitable sector and wider voluntary sector is in fact a race problem, or more forthrightly, it is a problem of racism. A problem about which there is much denial, and indeed the language of diversity can sometimes be used to play down and distract from issues of racism. So the study. Research and writing for Home Truth took place between around March 2019 and June 2020. Before talking about the findings, I want to say a word about racism. As I mentioned to you, the word comes up a lot in the report. It's 191 times, but it's such a misunderstood concept, or so multiply understood, that it's worth tying down somewhat. The definition that we borrow in the report, that we use in the report rather, borrows from Kate Mann's definition of sexism in the book Down Girl, The Logic of Misogyny. So in our definition of racism, we are interested in three elements. The first is ideology, so a belief system that reifies, i.e. makes real, race and racial hierarchy, even though these things are kind of scientific nonsense. Social design is the second element, which is informed by such ideologies. For example, laws, institutional practices, and everyday customs take on this ideology and spread it. And then the third element that we're particularly interested in is about harm. So you've probably heard sometimes someone says something and then someone does a fake apology. So I apologize for any offence caused. So it's a kind of non-apology, and it kind of loads the problem of those who might be offended. So what we talk about in thinking about racism is harm. And harm is, of course, different. And in particular in Home Truths and in my other work, I'm interested in harms experienced by racially minoritized populations that are not experienced by their white counterparts. That means that racially minoritized people in various different settings can be underserved, undervalued, over-scrutinized and over-sanctioned. That's certainly those aspects of racism come through in Home Truths. Thinking about racism in this or any other way does not deny any other forms of repression that exist. In particular, racism and paying attention to racism is entirely compatible with the idea that working class people who are white, and here I'm being very careful not to use the term white working class, which acts as if all working class people are white, so which is clearly not correct. But we recognise that working class people who are white can also be subject to being underserved, undervalued, over-scrutinised and over-sanctioned in certain or even many aspects of life. But some of the underlying ideological underpinnings constraining social design and harms may be different depending on whether one is white or one is BME or racially minoritized. Finally, on racism, I think it's really important for me to say that the existence of racism does not mean that the lives of all racially minoritized people are at every turn thwarted by racism. Most importantly, a focus on racism does not mean that racially minoritized people individually and collectively are helpless victims of racism. Instead, we are agents in making our own lives and remaking context. So there were 5 main elements to the Home Truth study here. So there's testimony from racially minoritized charity sector people via interview and e-survey, interviews with charity sector leaders, most of whom were white, case studies of charities attempting to address EDI, equity, diversity, inclusion issues, 1 race equity advocate roundtable discussion, 1 roundtable discussion with what we call system shapers, those who influence the operating environment for charities and the voluntary sector, including funders, charity recruiters and regulators. For efficiency, I'm going to focus on 2 elements, the e-survey results and some insights from engagements with charity leaders about how they are thinking about race and racism in the sector. Partly because of some marketing help from our friends at Charity So White, we received around 500 responses to our e-survey aimed at BME/racially minoritized people in the charity sector. And the respondents had been involved in a variety of ways as interns, employees, volunteers, associates, freelancers, trustees, and to findings. From our respondents, and of course, you know, in a room full of researchers, all the caveats applies. It's a self-selected respondent sample, so that brings lots of caveats with it, and we need to be careful about extrapolating and so on. But it's clear that racism for our set of respondents is definitely a feature of their life in the charity sector, as some of these results will indicate. So kind of 3 key statistics that we found. So 68%, which is about 335 of our respondents, have experienced, witnesses, or heard stories about racism during the charity sector. So either directly or indirectly, it's around. It's a kind of it's a known force, and so it's there and it's around and it's known and it's talked about as well. Next, 61% of our respondents say they feel or have felt that they need to outperform white British counterparts to make comparable progress in the charity sector. I'm going to talk a little bit in a moment about kind of the weight of this and the emotional labour and so on that is required to deal with it, but that's one aspect of it. And then the third one is half of our respondents felt that they needed to tone down behaviour or be on best behaviour in order to fit in the charity sector. So again, there's certain requirements that are not there for white British counterparts in particular. In the presence of these factors, so the existence of BME or racially minoritized people in the charity sector seems to kind of mobilize a certain response. It sees a machinery of racism coming into play, in which things like over-scrutiny of racially minoritized people is highly present, as well as kind of sanctioning and punishment and control at times. So this in turn leads to a coping strategy of toning down behaviour, akin to what Kenji Yoshino calls covering, or the idea of code switching, where you're changing your behaviour, your ways of speaking, your demeanour in order to fit in. And this is unseen and invisible labour. There are negative consequences of doing this work of covering, which shows in the data of health and well-being in our survey, where 116 people stated that their direct experiences of racism had led to them having negative impacts on their health or emotional well-being. So this stuff weighs heavy. It has consequences. There is harm. But a failure to cover adequately is costly too. So that has consequences. So this is one quote. I always feel like I was held to a higher level of standard than anybody else. I could say one thing the wrong way and I'd be penalised. This is one of our interviewees, not from the e-survey, but from a face-to-face interview. And this quote emphasises this threat of sanction that exists, faces some BME people in the workplace. This problem may exist in other workplaces in the public and private sector, but one of the themes of the e-survey and also in our interviews with BME charity people is that there may be a particular problem in the voluntary and charity sector because of, not despite, the ethical positioning of charities and the voluntary sector more generally. I'll explain that a bit. So, one of our other interviewees said, I think that desire to downplay racism comes from white society's self-denial, especially charities, because they feel themselves as the good guys. It's almost to say it's a reflection of them. They don't want to look in the mirror and say, you know, I'm actually part of the problem. So this interviewee and a number of others in our study point to the charity sector perhaps hiding behind a veneer of respectability and seeking to defend that line. And there is something specific being mentioned about the discomfort of talking about racism in the sector, perhaps because it lifts veil on certain double standards that exist within it. And of course, as we know, the history of the charity and voluntary sector suggests that it is built on a kind of ethical fault line. For example, we can see the sector's interconnection with state apparatus and agendas such as colonialism and control of the lower orders. Alongside this is the way that the doing of charitable work can be used to signal virtue and self-righteousness, and mark the doers as morally superior compared to people who are deficient and who need to be saved from themselves as much as anything else. And of course, this sorting can be highly racialized and racist because voluntaristic efforts emerge from dominant culture as well as sometimes running counter to it. And that dominant culture is racialized and racist. The second element of the study that I want to turn to are the findings from the interviews with charity leaders, most of whom were white. Some broad themes emerge in the interviews. So, among these are recognition that the sector is not representative of communities. I'll say a bit more about that in a moment. Among the leaders, there was a lack of in-depth understanding about race and racism, and also a concern about saying the wrong thing and the potential reputational damage that could result in. There was also a tendency to think about and describe racism as almost inevitable, rather than something that these leaders felt they had power to change. In these findings, we can see a focus among leaders of being representative of the communities in which their organisations are located, or those communities that these organisations serve. In fact, as I will outline shortly, this is an overly narrow perspective on the question of race and racism, and we need to think not only about who does the work and whether they look like the people that they serve, beneficiaries, but we also need to think about how does that work engage in questions and issues of race equity. In other words, we need to look beyond questions of representation in the voluntary and charity sector and look towards questions of purpose. Alongside this slightly reductive way of looking at the issue, some of these leaders express a form of helplessness, not so much a fight response, so there wasn't, racism isn't real, up, but more a flight or a freeze response. So there is a sense of that something must be done, and a quiet terror of what that might mean. And I think perhaps in some quarters there's a recognition among some of these leaders that they as individuals are poorly placed to lead on the issue, and I think that kind of creates some of this flight and freeze response. So I'll just talk a bit about recommendations we made. We made a number of recommendations. 7 were aimed at organisational leaders and or organisational policy. These are they. Remember, this was all written up largely before George Floyd was murdered, late May of 2020. So first thing was about learning more about racism. In particular, this was we would get some of these some of the leaders in the sector asking other people to do the work and not doing the work themselves, or asking for explanations, which kind of creates multiple burdens on those who perhaps are experiencing racism. Agree, adapt, and share a definition of what racism and race equity is. So I kind of alluded to earlier, I think it's language, but not necessarily a grip of what the language means, and that feels important if we're to move towards change. CEO boards, board chairs to take responsibility and be accountable for progress. I can't actually remember whether it made it to the final cut, but at some point, I think I did suggest that pay could be tied to serious progress. I can't remember. I do remember we had a gentle disagreement on that, but I don't remember if it survived the final cut. But I'll say it here anyway. I'll come back to point 4 because I think that's quite an important one. Set and report, so going to the 5th point, set and report publicly stretching internal EDI targets, publish ethnicity pay gap data. Partly just on that, I don't think it's a magic bullet at all, but I think what it is, it's kind of interesting because it does force an organisation to look in the first place and also to share, and I think that does do something to the dynamic that's around here, and also redrafting hiring and firing criteria. Hiring criteria is really elastic, but we still have these kind of very narrow ideas about who can do the job and what excellence looks like, some of which is absolutely racialized, some of which is absolutely gendered, some absolutely operates on class lines as well. So I want to consider item 4 especially, pick up one of the things that I spoke about earlier. So the leaders interviewed in the project tended to be focused on the representativeness of the sector and the organisational workforce. So if we think of the equity, diversity and inclusion agenda, the emphasis has been primarily on diversity or lack of diversity of people in the sector. So there has been less focus on the behaviours associated with being inclusive. So what happens when you have BME people, like kind of what are the behaviours and what are the principles and the humanitarian, kind of like just being human, what does that look like? So there has been much less emphasis on being inclusive, and our e-survey results, I think, shows that. And I think we've seen little or no consideration by what I would call mainstream voluntary sector organisations on their role in causing racial inequity, or how they should stand with racially minoritised people and populations to eradicate racism and to ensure racial justice and equity. So the 4th item here really kind of speaks to that. And in this set of recommendations, the most fundamental of the recommendations, it's probably the hardest and the most important. It asks us to consider and change what the voluntary sector is for. It suggests the need for a restorative and healing voluntary sector. It argues that while racism erases people's history, humanity, their possibilities, and at times their lives, voluntary sector organisations should be working to heal and restore wholeness to society. And you can't do that This means that we must go beyond thinking about diversity or its absent. The task is not just about changing the singer, i.e. who does the work, but it is about changing the song, i.e. the work itself. That means organisations changing their missions to explicitly make the pursuit of racial equity meaningful to why they exist. Okay. The final bit I want to go into is in the here and now and what is to come. So we finished most of the original research in Home Truths probably by early 2020. So now I just want to talk a bit more about what is to come and what might be in the future. So disproportionate impacts of COVID-19 on the lives and livelihoods of BME populations and the BME-led voluntary sector has raised the profile of issues of race and racial disparities in society and the voluntary sector. More importantly, the visibility of the murder of George Floyd has made it difficult, at least for a time, to dodge the question of racism and the different treatment and outcomes available to some racially minoritized people. In the voluntary sector, there has been some repositioning on race. For example, clunkily and incompletely, we've seen funders become more open to funding BME-led organisations and work that is explicitly about racial justice. Some voluntary sector organisations have issued solidarity statements on BLM, Black Lives Matter. Some of these will be well-intentioned and a precursor to the hard graft of institutional change. In other cases, I do think these statements will be largely performative. Elsewhere, racism at NCBO and Amnesty International UK have come prominently into the public square because of the heightened attention on racism in this moment. Both NCBO and Amnesty International have apologised and promised to change, with the latter, Amnesty, especially seeking to align itself with anti-racism. Other high-profile organisations such as Wellcome Trust and Mind, who have not, as far as I know, been hit by public scandal, have also explicitly named their commitment to anti-racism. These attempted realignments are at the very least noteworthy. In time they may seem more significant than that. I think we have to wait and see. I've spoken at numerous events in the last year since Home Truths was published, and I frequently get asked who's doing well on EDI, and I think we don't know yet. It will take time for the answers to emerge. And also I think any assessment would need to centre insight from racially minoritized people working for and affected by the work of these organisations. But I think it is important to note that some of this change will be difficult. In July 2020, we ran a session on Home Truths for Akivo members. We had about 40 people on the call, and one of the questions was to ask participants to name some serious blockages to implementing the recommendations that were suggested in the report, which I kind of showed you before. And the results are here. So not everyone answered the question, so for those of you good at maths, you'll notice that it doesn't add up to 40 in every instance. And it's a small sample of leaders, but these are the keeners, so I think it is worth saying that. Because it's a small sample, we can't overread into it, but I do think that some of these issues are more broadly significant. So concern that race alone overlooks other aspects of diversity, even, for example, class and gender, the difficulty of talking about race, and uncertainty of how to build race equity into charity mission. So I think all of these things are real, and all of these things are real in the wider voluntary sector. Just to pass some very kind of brief comments on this. I think on the first one, sometimes the way intersectionality gets mobilised, the idea that there are different groups differently oppressed, and sometimes they're a compound, you know, like black women suffer in particular ways, which the original research on intersectionality suggests. But sometimes I do think that part of the problem is sometimes intersectionality is almost mobilised in a a way to say it's too complicated to do anything, or we can't act on racism without doing all of these other things. And I think that's highly problematic because it means you don't act on racism. Just briefly onto the difficulty of talking about race and racism. I think that's real and that's genuine. But sometimes I think there's an imagined, some of that can be a bit more imagined. So I've spoken to charity leaders who think that if they say the wrong thing, they'll be jumped on by a band of racial justice activists. And I think that's wrong, actually. And I think racial justice activists are really busy. They've got, they've got a lot going on. So I think that's probably kind of slightly over-censoring the importance of what any one charity leader said. So I think we can discount some of that fear. And I think Jane Bolgert, who's an educationalist, says, I think we need to follow her advice, and she says, you learn to talk about race and racism by talking about race and racism. It seems to me that's right, and that's why these kind of conversations are hopefully helpful. The blockage over how to build race equity into charity strategy is a valid one. I think none of us has lived in a world without injustice, without misogyny, without racism, without xenophobia. So there aren't really the templates. We don't really know how to build the organisations that kind of live the values that we might be talking about. So there's no exact template for institutional transformation. I think the issue of strategy also links to a larger question of whether organisations that are built either to ignore racism and or to institutionalise it in the worst cases can reformulate themselves sufficiently to deliver racial equity. So for example, in another setting, the idea of defunding the police, that comes because there is, I think, quite a legitimate idea that current models of policing cannot be reformed to move seriously towards anti-racism and life-affirming ways of resolving conflict. So I think pragmatically we should encourage existing voluntary sector organisations to try to transform, but some may actually need to be dismantled so that they can be more radically reimagined and replaced. So I just want to say a bit more about the future. So we're planning a follow-up to Home Truths, funding pending, and all of that stuff, as you all know. So the first project really focused on the problem of race, or what is the nature of the problem. And in the second project, we're much more going to be focused on solutions and how we can go further and faster towards the sector becoming a wellspring for race equity. And in particular, we are focused on creating conditions that that will both demand and deliver a decisively life-affirming voluntary sector in which race equity is central. We have 4 main interventions we want to make in further faster program. So I want to strengthen the BME-led voluntary sector as drivers of change in the mainstream voluntary sector. We want to develop know-how on what can be done to radically enhance the voluntary sector race equity impact. We want to do the research work of tracking BME outcomes inside the voluntary sector, and we want to support leaders of mainstream organisations who want to move further and faster, because they are out there, but they're not necessarily connected. So we think that those elements are vital in creating the conditions for change in the voluntary sector, and that's this slide that I've got up here. So we think these elements help support the conditions for change in the voluntary sector. So in the kind of 12 o'clock kind of face, BME-led voluntary sector is able to engage, bring ideas, challenge mainstream civil society. We have know-how and solutions, and these are developed and spread. Intelligence is gathered on outcomes for BME people, and we have motivated mainstream civil society leaders and organisations who are connected to each other so they can do their work together. So, activity in Home Truths sequel will include a new e-survey of BME people in the voluntary sector, and we'll look at experiences more than a year on from the onset of COVID-19 and the murder of George Floyd. And we will convene a network of further faster voluntary sector leaders to build a community for peer learning and exchange in the mainstream sector. So in closing, I think there are three things I want to say. First is that we have to sit with this uncomfortable idea that the voluntary sector is a site of racism. Recent history tells us when there is a focus on racism, there seems to be a counter movement to move that focus on because of the discomfort it causes. So in particular, I'm thinking about first an inquiry into Stephen Lawrence in 1999, more recently Grenfell and the Windrush scandal. This impetus to move away and focus on something else. I would call on us all to not let our attention slip, and kind of remind us of what James Baldwin says, which is not everything that is faced can be changed, but nothing can be changed until it is faced. So we need to face down this issue and continue to do so. Second is to consider again why we are here as a sector, if, as I suggest, the role of the voluntary sector is restorative. Racial equity and social justice must come to the fore. This means taking corrective action in the world, recognising how issues like race, gender and class may limit the ways people walk in the world. It demands an intentional, life-affirming stance. The third thing that I'd like to say is this vision of a voluntary sector transformed is more likely if it is underpinned by a research agenda refocused. There is an old adage in the evaluation world. It states that what gets counted counts. Put another way, what we measure matters. So I think the research community has a vital role to play in securing gains in race equity by paying attention to issues of racism and race equity in ways that it has not done previously. As researchers, we cannot simply look to the voluntary sector for change. We need to be prepared to look at ourselves and move questions of race, racism and race equity into our everyday explorations. In this way, we won't only be tracking change, we will be embodying